Massad, how are you doing, sir?
Just Mass is fine. I'm doing great. Hope you are too.
Oh, we're doing absolutely wonderful. We're just totally honored to have you on the line. Joe has been gushing like crazy, so you must have done something good in his class.
Okay, so Mass, welcome on. Welcome aboard here to the show. Glad you could find some time to call in here. I just went down a rundown of your history, just a very brief description of that. One of the things we were talking about, in San Diego County, we were just able to get our concealed carry rights back. And through the efforts of San Diego County gun owners, and we had a lot of help, we were able to persuade our sheriff to start issuing. So for the first time in decades now, citizens can get their concealed carry here in San Diego. And
kudos to you and the sheriff for doing that.
Yeah, it was great. And the sheriff's really doing a good job now, complete 180 turnaround on their whole approach to things. And I was telling the folks, I took your MAG 20 class last year up in Covina, and It was just fascinating. I took the classroom part of it, and just the discussion and the information you put out on the legal aspects of this, of carrying concealed, and if you're involved in an incident, and the stuff that goes on. And I was going to ask, could you talk a little bit about that, just briefly, what you cover in your MAG 20 class, and then the stuff that the Massad Ayoob group, offers training-wise?
Sure. Basically, we teach every year in California, usually in Sacramento. We did the class in San Diego County last year and may do one of those in the future, though we don't have one scheduled. On the legal side of it, the handling the aftermath, the big problem is historically we ask a lawyer, hey, what do we do if we're involved in a shooting? And the lawyer tells us, shut up, shut up, shut up. Wait till I get there. Tell him you want a lawyer and say it over and over again. And the problem with that is your typical defense lawyer has spent his life dealing with people who are, in fact, guilty to some degree of a crime. The advice that becomes second nature for him is don't say anything to the police, because if the person is culpable, anything they say is either going to be a lie that's going to make things worse or going to be a confession. The problem is when you've done the right thing, following the bad guy's advice, the advice you give to a guilty man, essentially you're getting the advice for guilty men that comes from a guilty man's lawyer, and it's probably going to start you on the way to a guilty man's verdict. I've come to call it false positive effect. And when I say that, usually the term is used in medicine. Let's say you or I were suddenly stricken acutely ill, and they rushed us to the emergency room. We're obviously in a life-threatening crisis, and let's say we're exhibiting every symptom that the medical texts and the collective experience of the medical people associate with disease A. We can expect they're going to diagnose us for disease A, and they're going to treat us for disease A. If, however, we instead have disease B, and the treatment for A is contraindicated for a B patient, and they lose the patient, well, in the medical world, that's called a negative outcome. In our world, it's called innocent person being charged with murder or manslaughter. And to see how that works, let's come out of the emergency room and out in the street. Let's say tonight one of your listeners is violently attacked. They have a permit to carry a gun and defend themselves, thank God, and they do. The bad guy is down hemorrhaging, maybe screaming, he's dropped his gun. From the first responding officer on, their collective experience has been at a shooting scene, unless it's officer involved, whoever is laying in the puddle of blood generally turned out to be the victim. Whoever was standing there with a smoking gun generally turned out to be the perpetrator. The actual perpetrator that your listener has defeated is now laying in a puddle of blood doing a remarkably convincing imitation of a victim. Your good guy is standing there with a smoking gun. What's the first correlation of symptom to diagnosis? Now, in their history, every genuine victim that they've ever talked to, when they said, what happened, said, that SOB did such and such to me, and I'll testify against them in court. And just about every guilty SOB they ever arrested, and they said, buddy, we're happy to hear your side of the story, said, I ain't telling you nothing till my mouthpiece gets here. The guy who shot is laying on the street, and maybe his last words are, he shot me. for nothing. And they ask you, what's your side of the story? I want a lawyer. I'm not talking to you without a lawyer. Well, what do you think is how the symptoms are going to be read? What do you think is going to be the diagnosis? What do you think is going to be the treatment?
And that seems to happen far too often when somebody has to defend themselves, that they actually quite possibly get the finger pointed at them. And what we want to do is we just want to go to a quick commercial break, and we want to continue this conversation on the other side of the commercial break. Can you stay with us?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to take a quick break, folks. Don't touch that.
Okay, so we're back. So, Mas, could you continue on your thought there?
Well, I tell folks you don't want to spill your guts and start babbling because you're going to get some things wrong. When you've been through a near-death experience, you're the worst person in the world to be answering questions like how far apart were you, exactly how long did it take, exactly how many shots were fired. What you do need to do is establish a baseline. So since the early 1980s, I've been teaching what I call a 5-point checklist, and I'm happy to say a lot of other teaching organizations have adopted it. The 5 points are the first thing I would want to say if I had been in an incident like that, and once the police arrived, was explain the active dynamic. And the active dynamic is not that you shot an attacker. The active dynamic is what he did that forced you to shoot him. This man attacked me, or this man attacked my spouse, or whatever it was. Second, indicate that you will cooperate, that you will sign a complaint, words to that effect, I'll testify against him in court, something like that. You are confirming you're the good guy and he's the bad guy. Third, for God's sake, point out the evidence. People who don't work in law enforcement or emergency services don't realize how ephemeral evidence is at a scene of violence. In minutes, the place is going to be literally trampled by emergency medical service personnel, police officers, spent casings, for example. Somebody simply kicks the spent casing. They're not going to notice that they kicked it, but it goes skidding down the sidewalk. And later it looks like, the gun was fired from point A, not from point B, where the defendant says it was. The spent brass 380, 9mm, 40, 45 is just the right size to get caught in the treads of the emergency boots that you see police officers, paramedics, and firefighters wearing. Sometimes it literally walks away from the scene. Sometimes as they continue to walk and the sole flexes, it deposits the spent casing some distance from where it actually originally was. We've had cases of bystanders picking up spent casings as souvenirs.
And that throws a wrench in the works. That'll actually work against somebody or throw off a case.
Yeah, and that's just one element. If the guy dropped a knife, tell the cops he dropped a knife, here's where it is. Somebody's going to pick the damn thing up and walk with it. Fourth, point out witnesses. The I don't want to get involved syndrome that was identified in the early 1960s is still with us. There's a whole lot of folks who figure, I don't want to have to lose time in court going to testify. And if you don't identify them, they're going to leave the scene, and their testimony that would have proven you were telling the truth is going to disappear with them. Finally, the fifth point of the checklist, it would be at that point that I would respectfully stop answering questions and say, officer, you're going to have my full cooperation after I've spoken with counsel. I need to call my attorney now.
That's amazing. And a lot of that is counter to all the myths, everything that you kind of hear, like, oh, don't say anything until, everything you see in a movie or maybe you hear on, a TV show or something like that. But that all makes a lot of sense and is extremely interesting.
Well, the reason for that is I've been working as an expert witness in this type of case since 1979. I've been a cop longer than that. I spent 2 years as co-vice chair of the Forensic Evidence Committee for National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. So what I'm saying, Mike, I know a hell of a lot of defense lawyers. I've talked to guys who went a 30, 40-year career and told me they felt they had never defended a truly innocent man who wasn't at least guilty of some lesser-included offense. Most of them will tell you it's extremely rare. It's probably the upper 90th percentile of people who end up being arrested and accused are, in fact, guilty. That's why so many of them plead. If their whole experience has been, it's a guilty guy, talking to the police will do him no good and will probably harm him, it becomes their default. It becomes their reflexive advice. And it's not the right advice for that rare Perry Mason kind of client who is innocent, did the right thing, but whether it's someone got the wrong impression, whether it's a political prosecution, and God knows we've all seen those, if they don't immediately at the beginning establish, look, here's what happened, here's what you need to look for, nobody else is going to do it for you. And it's really going to give your defense lawyers an uphill fight as things go forward.
So, Mass, based on your experience, do you find, because you do a lot of court-related stuff, a lot of cases basically with self-defense issues, do you find that a lot of self-defenders are pretty well prepared and they've taken the time to learn and to train and to kind of do things right to have a good, a good chance when they get in there to be able to defend themselves or be able to help their lawyers defend themselves? Because I know just generally speaking, statistically, concealed carriers are a pretty well-behaved bunch. They've got a pretty good record in terms of not getting in trouble. But when they do get involved in a self-defense incident, again, do you find that a lot of them were knowledgeable or a lot of them were lacking in that?
I find generally they won because they were prepared, they knew this might happen, and they were ready for it. And that's why they won the fight. A whole lot of folks haven't thought beyond that. A whole lot of training classes that I've been to never mention it. One of the most famous self-defense classes had one sentence. The founder and lead instructor would say, if you want to know when you can shoot somebody, talk to a lawyer. I'm here to teach you how to win a gunfight. And if all you've heard is the old BS of never talk to the police, blah, 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 you're going to have a problem. The single biggest mistake, most common mistake I see made, the armed citizen does everything right. And as you know, you've studied this stuff, the great majority of times, no shots are fired at all. The bad guy sees the gun, they realize they're about to suffer what I've come to call a sudden and acute failure of the victim selection process, and they run. And that's fine. The good guy did everything right. And then they holster their gun and they sigh a sigh of great relief and don't think to call the police.
Yeah. Somebody
across the street saw them pull a gun on somebody, then they got into their car and they wrote down their license tag.
And the first one on the phone seems to always be the most influential.
It's absolutely true. And the reason is the whole justice system is geared on the assumption that the original complainant is the victim, the first person to call in. Whoever does not call in is the perpetrator. Now, it's counterintuitive to most people. They don't picture bad guys calling the police, but it happens all the time. If you've got your career criminal who's been going through the revolving door of the criminal justice machine since he was a juvenile offender, he knows how things work. He's furious that you've been able to do this role reversal on him. He's going to hide his weapon. He's going to call the police. He's going to give them your description and say, this crazy guy pulled the gun on me for nothing, and I'll press charges. He has become the complainant. You have become the suspect. And the first question you're going to get was, if you did the right thing, why didn't you call in? Gee, a crime was being committed against you, felony aggravated assault, attempted armed robbery, and you failed to report that felony, and you're telling us you're the good guy? And that doesn't ring true to the investigating officer, and it doesn't ring true to your typical juror either.
Well, one of the things we've done is, it's kind of a unique situation in San Diego where we have hundreds of thousands of gun owners and people that shoot regularly and go to the range, and they've been experienced shooters for decades and are now have the ability to get a CCW. And when we've started a series of classes where we just teach people how to get through the paperwork to get a CCW. It's not that bad, but it needs a little instruction. So we put on these classes, and one of the things we emphasize a lot is, hey, this isn't about marksmanship anymore. For 10, 20 years, you've been shooting at a piece of paper in a lane. You're going to be able to hit the, a 3x5 card at 20 yards or whatever, not a problem. It's all the other stuff. It's where can you carry? When can you use a firearm? And no matter how good you are at pulling from concealment and getting 2 shots on target, it's all this other stuff that are these enormous bear traps. And I don't know.
True, and that's why we do a 20-hour class on just that stuff.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, and no one's taken into consideration, this might be your first time pulling your firearm and using it. So you're not going to be calm, cool, and collected, I wouldn't think. What do you think, Moss?
Well, you are calm, cool, and collected enough to beat a predator at his own game.
Yeah.
I talk to people who tell me, oh, I'll never remember those 5 points. I thought, okay, you're walking around carrying a loaded gun in public. You can't remember 5 things. Let's think about this. When you draw the gun, how many things are you doing?
Right.
Remember to clear the cover garment. Remember to take a firm, high-hand grip. Remember to keep your finger off the trigger. You remember to release the whatever device you might have had that's securing the gun in the holster. You remember to rock and lock. You remember to bring it up to line of sight. If you could remember that, it's because you've done all the repetitions, you've visualized yourself doing it. Now what you need to do is prepare yourself mentally for what you're going to do afterwards. It ain't that tough.
Wow.
So let's keep.
We're going to keep you some more because you just messed up. You shouldn't be as good as you are. Because now we're going to let you have another 15-minute segment. Can you hang with us?
Absolutely.
You are the man, brother.
So we still have Ayoob on the line, one of the legends of the firearms world. And we've been talking to him here for the last couple of segments. So we're going to continue because he's such a great guy and has offered to stay here and talk to us. So what I started to say was I got my latest issue of American Handgunner, in which Mass writes a couple of columns each issue. And he wrote a really interesting column on Doc Holliday and was talking about some of the self-defense incidents that Doc Holliday was involved in. And a couple of concepts that actually kept Doc out of trouble with those things. And the two concepts he talks about is reasonableness and disparity of force. And those are two important concepts in modern day self-defense incidents and cases. And Matt, could you talk about those a little bit and exactly, what they are and then how they're used today?
One of them, he had shot a man in a bar who turned out to be unarmed. And what saved him in court was many witnesses testified that the man he shot had told Holliday and had told them that he was going to stomp Holliday, that he was going to kill Holliday, etc. when he saw him. Holliday had planted a gun behind the bar at the end of the bar and hung out at the end of the bar. And when the guy came in, turned on him with a hand in a pocket as if he had a gun, Holliday drew that weapon and shot the guy down. And the court held that he had, while the other man did not have a gun, it was a reasonable belief on Holliday's part when he took the action that he did. And then and now, that has been the standard for the cop and it has always been for the citizen. It wasn't really for the cop until the Graham versus Connor decision by the Supreme Court in 1989 that said, in essence, you don't have to be right. You have to be reasonable. The standard for the private citizen is what would a reasonable, prudent person have done in the exact same situation, knowing what the defendant knew. For the police officer, it's slightly more rigid, according to Graham versus Connor. What would a trained, experienced police officer have done in the exact same situation, knowing what that officer knew at the time? So the reasonable man standard worked in that case for Holliday.
So his opponent was somebody who would reasonably have access to a gun, who was making threats on his life, and who was pretending to have a gun. So any reasonable person, including Doc Holliday, would assume that, hey, this is all completely legitimate. He absolutely could make good on the threats that he's making towards him. So shooting him in that situation would be considered defense.
And it goes back to, remember we were discussing the false positive in the first segment. The bottom line is, if you waddle like a duck, if you quack like a duck, if you have feathers like a duck, you will be identified as waterfowl.
Yeah.
And the person who shot you essentially is going to be seen as the person you tricked into shooting him.
It's interesting. Have you been to Tombstone, Moss?
Oh, yeah. Loved it.
Yeah, there's a did you see there's a
history there?
There is a lot of history. Did you see there's a hole in the wall there at that? There's a bar. They have a bar there, and in the back there's a hole in the wall from a round from Doc Holliday's gun. Is the claim?
Lots of history.
Yeah.
While you're there, spend some time at the courthouse. They have all the original documents from the hearing on that shooting.
Oh, wow.
Including the diagram that Wyatt Earp drew for the court of the shooting scene. The other point that you had brought up from Holliday's trials was disparity of force. Doc Holliday died at 36. His young adulthood, he was plagued with what they called then consumption, and we now know to be tuberculosis. At a time when he weighed 120, 130 pounds, he was attacked by a 180-pound man. And his testimony was he was frail, he was fragile, he could barely breathe, and this person would have killed him if he hadn't used a gun to defend himself. And the courts accepted that. The disparity of force principle has always been with us. Essentially, it means if your attacker is unarmed, if his physical capability to kill or cripple you is so great, so much greater than yours to do the same to him, it becomes the equivalent of a deadly weapon on his side of the fight, and it warrants your recourse to a per se lethal weapon, such as a defensive firearm, to stop the attack. Most commonly, it would be a huge disparity in size and strength, as was the case in Holliday's trial. It could also be very commonly force of numbers. You're 2 or 3 unarmed men violently attacking you. As a general rule, male attacking female. Able-bodied attacking the handicapped, even if the handicap has taken place in the course of the instant assault. It could also be position of disadvantage. Maybe you're as big and strong as the other guy or stronger, but he's got you up against the wall, he's banging your skull against a brick wall, and there's no other way to stop him. Things of that nature. But you'll find basically it becomes an affirmative defense in which, real world, the burden of proof does fall back onto the private citizen.
You know,
people don't understand how that works. Most states will say in the law, once self-defense is on the table at trial, the burden of proof now goes, as always, to the prosecution to show that it was not self-defense. However, what you've got here is 2 things going. First, for you to be able to get that in play at all, for the judge to allow your attorney to utter the words self and defense in the same sentence. In a pretrial hearing, you're going to have to establish an element called burden of production. Burden of production in this case means you have to show the court some corroborating evidence beyond just taking your word for it that it was self-defense, some physical evidence, some eyewitness testimony. So in burden of production, I think the operative term is burden right there. But the real reason it does shift the burden of proof, real-world jury psychology. All your witnesses have talked to people about this and have met the guy who doesn't know the difference between murder and homicide. They think they're the same thing. They've heard at the opening of trial your attorney say, yeah, my client shot and killed him. They hear that as a confession of murder. In real-world jury psychology, the burden falls on the defense to establish to the jury that this was, in fact, self-defense. Here's why. So real world, go on the assumption you will literally be guilty until proven innocent.
So this is something that just kind of occurred to me, and if it's not a specific case that you've studied or are familiar with, then feel free to just say, hey, it's not something I know much about or have studied enough to comment on something like that. But I think the biggest, most controversial defensive gun use case in recent history. What are your impressions of, or what can you talk about, or what can you say about the Trayvon Martin case?
Well, there's a long chapter in my book on that, and if your listeners want to read my take on it for free, go to backwoodshome.com. I'm the firearms editor for that publication, and on their website, on the main page, click on blogs, and then click on my name. They have the archives of my work going back to about 2007. They'll want to start on July 13, 2013. That was the day of the Zimmerman acquittal. And that's when I began a 20-part analysis of the case.
Wow.
I hadn't been able to discuss it prior because early on in the case, Craig Saunders, Zimmerman's first attorney, had called me in as an expert witness for the case. And I felt it would be a conflict of interest to discuss it publicly until the verdict came in. But basically, we looked at it from the prosecutor's side, from the defense side, from the jury's side, And the bottom line of it is the jury had the right verdict. The hard evidence absolutely showed that Zimmerman was down, his head was being banged against the concrete sidewalk. Zimmerman said he had seen the gun become visible in the waistband of his pants, and it said, "You're going to die tonight," as he reached for the gun. And as Trayvon Martin reached for the gun, Zimmerman said he slapped the man's hand away with his left hand, drew the pistol with his right hand, and fired the one shot that ended the fight. The hard evidence absolutely confirmed that. The hard evidence made it physically impossible for the state's theory that he shot Trayvon Martin while they were standing facing each other, or that Martin was down and Zimmerman shot him as he was on the ground. That both of those theories were physically impossible. But unfortunately, the media had picked up on the whole thing.
Well, one of the things that they picked up,
modern-day witch hunt.
It really appeared that way. One of the things that they picked up on that I still think is misunderstood and is some bad information is that they started throwing around the term "stand your ground." Can you clarify or explain? Did this case have anything to do with Florida's stand your ground law?
No, not at all. It's one of the most misunderstood pieces of legislation that there is. The Stand Your Ground law simply is a rescinding of the retreat requirement that some states have, requiring you to retreat before using deadly force if you can do so with complete safety to yourself and others. When you're down with a larger adult male, Trayvon Martin towered over George Zimmerman, and he is smashing your head onto the sidewalk, retreat is not an option.
So just to be 100% clear, had the Stand Your Ground law in Florida not existed, that case would have not gone any differently, correct?
In my opinion, it would not have.
Well, that's fascinating. That's fascinating.
By the way, I know George Zimmerman and I know his lawyers. Mark O'Mara will tell you it was not a Stand Your Ground case. Don West, the co-counsel, will tell you it was not a Stand Your Ground case. And George Zimmerman himself will tell you Stand Your Ground had nothing to do with it. It was straight-up self-defense.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us for 3 segments, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the work you've done professionally, and thank you so much. I think you and I actually have a friend in common, by the way, aren't you? I think you speak to Mark Halcon out here in San Diego with some regularity.
How is Mark?
He's doing great. He was actually one of the founding board members of San Diego County Gun Owners that got the CCW policies changed out here. So he's doing great. He's a wonderful guy.
Please tell him I said hello, and congratulations to you and all the responsible gun owners out there, and to the sheriff. You did the right thing, and you mark my words, it's going to save innocent lives.
Well, we look forward to having you out here.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get you back on again anytime you feel that you've got some news, that because we're the only gun show in California that I'm aware of. So we've got a full-time job. Just, we had to bump it from 1 hour to 2 hours just to be able to get all the information out there that the Second Amendment gun owner needs just to make right decisions. And we appreciate everything you do.
That's great. If any of your listeners are interested in more information on us, the website is MassadAyoobGroup.com. That's MASSADAYOOB Group.com.
All right, buddy. Hey, thanks very much, and Happy New Year, and we look forward to talking down the road.
We wish you and your listeners all the best.
Thank you, sir. All right,
without someone doing something about it, it's not going to get any better.